Hearty shalom to you, Jeffrey Seif here, and I want to talk to you about collusion and conspiracy. You go, oh, wait a minute, I thought we're done with all that. Well, I'm not talking about the current scheme of things. I'm going back to Acts chapter 23, where Paul was involved in a conspiracy. Oh, you mean Paul, Trump, they're all into that sort of thing, huh? Well, you know, innocent until proven guilty. Here, there was a conspiracy, and the actors in it were guilty as a $3 bill. As it turns out, when we get into Paul's story, we discover that things can go south on the quick. It looks sometimes that things are just getting out of control. They're getting out of hand. There's arrests, there's riots, there's... God bless Paul. He's in the middle of all that. He's just a preacher talking about Yeshua, but the world goes bonkers around him. It's like that sometimes, and you wonder, God, what are you up to? Well, in the midst of this storm, in verse 11, Paul's told that the reason why he's experiencing all this is setting the stage to send him off to Rome, where God's got plans for him to minister. Well, and here it's the ticket courtesy of the empire. He doesn't have to raise money to get there. They're going to arrest him and take him. Well, against that backdrop, as we're looking in the 23rd chapter, in verses 12 through 22, we learn of something else, that it was God's plan to get him to Rome to minister, but some were conspiring to thwart that. They weren't interested in whatever plans the Lord had for Paul. They had plans of their own. We're told in chapter 23, verse 12, that Judean leaders formed a conspiracy. See, conspiracy. They colluded one with another. We're told, binding themselves to an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed Paul. And then right after that, we're told there were 40 people involved in all this. Now, these are individuals who are identified as leaders, religious, secular, otherwise. These are people with means, and their energies are so ramped up. 40 of them conspiring, colluding, that they're not going to eat. These people lost a lot of weight because Paul wasn't killed, but they were doggedly determined to do him in, and that's the point that I want to note. You know, spiritual warfare turns into material warfare. You know, Paul says elsewhere, we're not contending against flesh and blood. Well, there's that which is moving behind the scenes, but it works through flesh and blood. And here are people in their mind's eye with their intention very, very explicitly stated. They've bound themselves with an oath to take nothing until they've killed Paul, according to verse 14. That's the bad news. The good news is that this plot was overheard. We're just coming out of the Purim season, and you might recall there was a plot, and Mordecai caught wind of it and was able to advise of it. And then similarly, in that story, Esther, being informed of the situation, acts accordingly. God places people in place, interestingly. And so here we're told in verse 16, against the backdrop of this conspiracy, the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush. We're kind of out there in a distant relationship, and he is privy to this. I don't know the particulars. We know that Paul had advanced in Judaism as a member of the Parushim. He himself is part of this elite guild of Jewish religious leaders, and we can assume that there's others in his family network who are similarly well-placed. They've evolved up in the religious leadership system. Well, here the sister, we're told, rather, the son of Paul's sister heard of the ambush, and he goes to the headquarters and informs, and then they bring this they bring this man to the commander in charge. And he says in verse 20, the Judean leaders have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the Sanhedrin tomorrow for further inquiry, and then the ambush is going to take place, as if they are about to investigate more thoroughly about him. But don't give in to them, for 40 have bound themselves by an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. again, these energies, they get so ramped up. In the aftermath of that, then in verse 22, the commander dismisses the young man, saying, "Tell no one that you have informed me about these things." Well, there's a few things that I want to alight upon in this brief moment with you, one of which is that God places his people for specific reasons. And here's just some person that came upon this news and passed it on. Sometimes someone can have news that can make all the difference. And this is true not just of this news, but it's the good news. We hold in ourselves the message that can really make a difference in other people's lives. Let's go out of our way to share that as we see being at play here. The other thing that I want to alight upon here simply is that bad things can happen to good people, and it really defies logic. I say that this man, what is it about Paul that invokes the ire of 40 men who are elite? They're not rabble, that they would then conspire like this with such dogged determination, binding by an oath these religious leaders not to eat until they've killed a man. I mean, that is so unjust. That is so off the scales in what we expect of leaders, religious leaders to be sure, and just leaders on the whole. This lack of law, this lawlessness that's set in motion because of a preacher. It reminds me that there really is a warfare going on. We don't contending against flesh and blood. We're not fighting with that, but against spirits and principalities. And so it is that the waves can roar. Well, all of that roaring aside, harking back to the verse right before this in verse 11, the Lord had stood beside Paul and told him, "Listen, take courage, that you must testify to me about me in Rome." And so it is. Reminds me of the psalmist says, "Why do the nations rage? It's so futile. The kings of the earth set themselves against God's anointed, and the Lord laughs, scoffs," he says in Psalm chapter 2, there early in the book. And so it is here that the nations rage, but God has his purpose and his kingdom carries on. Hey, listen, before I get out of here, let me just say that you might find yourself experiencing negative energy swirling round about you for reasons not your own, something spiritual, not just material. Let me encourage you to seek the Lord in prayer, persevere, and God's kingdom marches forward. Difficulties notwithstanding, God is working and watching over his word to perform it. Jeffrey Seif here. Thanks for going with me on this journey. Let's do this again in a week. Ciao.